job.
Thank you.
Looks good.
Appreciate that. By the way,
I got to go to your beard guy.
it's Russ is the one who turned me on to the beard guy.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, it's great. No, they don't do I think he does some of like the waxing things with like.
What do you mean?
Ear stuff? Nothing. Not at all. You've never talked to me about any of that ever. Growing up.
That's awesome.
Only because I walked away from the beard guy and I was like, "Hey, could you get some of that out there?" Speaking of ear hair, we're on episode 5.
Wow, 5. We made it to 5.
We made it
Cinco.
to 5.
All right.
And we're not going to talk about grooming
beards
the whole time. What we hear. So last week, if I remember correctly, we were getting into the tower. Like the whole thing was about God remembers.
Yep.
And we talked about how with Noah, we talked about that big, huge, I forgot the...
Chiasm.
I
got one for you today, too.
Ooh.
Different one.
You know your audience. That's half the battle. And that giant piece of 3 chapters of Scripture of the story of Noah in the center of it being God remembers. And this week is, if you were listening to the sermon, or if you were at church this week, is about Babel, Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel. And the name Nimrod, which you brought up a little last week, too.
And boy, did you say that name a lot in the sermon. And
I felt good about it. My mom, I don't know if she's watching, but she's like, potty mouth. So I got 2 things. I want to go back to the Nimrod piece, and then I want to jump back to what Pastor Sarah did with the Samaritan woman at the well about 4 or 5 weeks ago.
Okay.
Because there's a chiasm in the Gospel of John, the whole Gospel of John, basically, that points us to something really cool.
Very cool.
And it deals with what we're talking about here too. So I know when this runs, the election is going to be over. Well, at least the Tuesday will be done.
We'll be done at the polls.
Yeah, I don't know when anything's going to happen. And I know there are a lot of people that are really worried and, both camps or whatever. And so and I always have people that tell me, tell me what you think. And I'm like, no, that's not my job. My job is to preach the gospel. And so but I am sensitive to that when this comes out and people will be listening, there'll be some people that will be very happy and some people that will be sad and some people that will be worried and all those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're going to do this Sunday, though, is we're going to have a mission moment with a dental clinic here at Mission Outpost. The video is going to come out. And the goal for us is no matter who wins an election, I love what Pastor Sarah did this past Sunday in her prayer, that no matter who wins the election, there'll still work for us to do as individuals. And so when I preached that sermon on Nimrod, which was crazy timing.
Yeah.
And when we put this together this summer, we weren't even thinking about that at all.
Nope.
People have assumed that I was talking about one of the running for president people as a Nimrod.
Really?
Yeah. So
I didn't make that connection at all.
No, and that wasn't the goal, obviously, but some people make connections where there isn't. The bigger thing for me in all this stuff is that no matter what happens outside of our control, we cannot control who wins an election or who loses an election.
Right.
What we can do is make sure that in our lives, our relationships with our family, friends, our community, our schools, our local, our mission outpost, food shelf, all those kinds of things. How do we connect with our neighbor? How are we the neighbor? And start micro instead of macro. A lot of people want to change the macro, but if we don't change the micro, it doesn't matter. If we can't learn how to talk to our neighbors, we're in trouble. And there are people that are their marriages are being burnt because of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I just don't want that kind of power over anything in my life. Jesus is Lord. That's it. And yeah. So I want to kick that off with that a little bit. And the Nimrod thing, someone came up to me after service. I did not look this up. I forgot. He goes, there's a Nimrod, Minnesota.
There is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I remember when you said it, and I didn't know for sure, and I didn't want to put it like out into the world that I didn't actually know that.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is a Nimrod, Minnesota.
Yeah. So when you read the Tower of Babel, it doesn't make sense unless you go back and you read chapter 10, which is the genealogy. And we talked a lot about that on Sunday. Typically, a genealogy in Scripture will come right before something new is going to happen.
Right.
So right after Cain, there's a genealogy, a long one. And Pastor Sarah actually unpacked that really, really well in the Engaged Bible Study, where you see Seth comes in, and Cain and Seth now are brothers, but Cain has been banished. But this family ends up coming back together right before Noah. I mean, the genealogy, they split, and then there's a coming back together. And we can walk that through at some point in time. And then there's a genealogy between Noah and the tower. That's Genesis chapter 10. And then there's a genealogy right before Abraham, the call of Abraham, that we're going to be talking about this week in church. Pastor Sarah's preaching on that. By the way, it's her installation Sunday too, so we're excited for that. Yeah, I'm excited for that. So she'll be official.
I knew that.
Yeah. She had not been official for 2 months, but now she's official. So she's official.
She's just felt official this whole time.
She's official, yeah. And so to me, the Tower of Babel just does not make sense at all unless you read the genealogy in chapter 10, where it goes through Noah's descendants. And it starts with Ham. Well, part of it, it's Noah's son's Ham. I should be able to say Ham. I like Ham. New Prague Ham. I figured it out. I'm going to make it. And it goes all the way through all these different names of the sons of Ham, and then their son, and then there's the grandson and the great grandson, all the way down through, and then Nimrod comes up, and there's this paragraph about Nimrod, and Nimrod is described as the greatest warrior the earth has ever known up to that point, if in the line of the story, and it has this line before the Lord. Nimrod stands before the Lord as the greatest warrior. And in our English, we usually think that means that God has approved everything that Nimrod is doing before the Lord. But that's not what's happening. Nimrod also means rebel, or to rebel, or to be rebellious. So Nimrod is standing in plain sight in front of God, doing all of his stuff, and there's no regret at all. It's like out and out rebellion right in front of God's face. And the rebellion is against God's purposes. Nimrod is very, very good at killing other humans. And he's got a reputation for it. And he's building all these cities, big, big cities. A lot of cities that we've never heard of, but we have heard of Babel or Babel, that this tower is being built. And we've heard of a city called Nineveh. That'll be great when we go and we talk about Jonah. Hope we're ready for some interesting things about that whole story too. And what Nimrod is doing, he has this technology which is brick and mortar, which is better than any technology available to build cities. Higher, bigger, stronger walls. You can hide behind them. You can defend them much easier. They're really, really big. They're more efficient to build because you can build uniform bricks. And it's a technology. I said it in worship on Sunday. It's a technology. It would be like if I had a Humvee and everybody else was traveling in a covered wagon. It's that kind of major technology.
That makes sense. Did Nimrod, was he the one who came up with this technology, or did he find...
Here's what I think. Nimrod is using this technology to build all these cities. I also think Nimrod is a name that represents a whole bunch of people. Nimrod has a huge following. Somehow he's building these cities, not by himself, and he's not killing everybody all by himself. He's got an army. He's got a tribe. He's got the wherewithal and the means to build, in Scripture, in the story, these really big cities. And whether or not he came up with the technology, maybe or maybe not, but he's using it. And so are his people, his followers.
Maybe using the technology in the way it's never been used before, but it existed.
No, that doesn't show. We don't see that in the story.
Yeah.
We just say that they have now this technology.
They just have the technology.
And I don't think that God is upset with the technology. I think God would be going, hey, great, you guys have figured out something really good. You can make stronger and better homes. You can create dwellings that do provide security. But what Nimrod is doing with it is the problem. It's not the technology in and of itself. It's what Nimrod's doing with it. I mean, Facebook in and of itself is not a problem.
Right.
But when people use it to disperse wrong information, or other countries are using it to convince others of whatever, that's the problem. The problem isn't the technology in and of itself. It's what people do with it. And Nimrod is using that technology to further his own ego.
Okay.
And he's doing it in front of God. It brings us back to, I think, the beast, because the snake, I think one of the things the snake is trying to do is trying to get Eve to be a beast. You don't need to be a human being. Mm-hmm. A beast does whatever it wants to do. And the beast is naked. The snake is naked. And it's like Nimrod is just standing naked before the Lord going, yep, I got this. This is what I'm doing. Clear out and out rebellion. It's like the founding fathers writing the Declaration of Independence and sending it to the king.
Yeah.
It's just like slap you in the face. We're doing this. What are you going to do about it? And so what God does about it is that God then disperses the people, and God uses language to confuse them, because they can no longer then work together to kill and to work against God's purposes. Now, some of the things that I've read also talk about the idea that God, some more Jewish midrash, is that either because of it or for reasons for it to disperse people, God is saying, now you got to work together and build relationships with people that don't talk like you, don't eat the same foods that you eat, don't dress the same way, live in different parts of the world. Figure out how to do things together. And when we talk about things like world peace, you have to overcome all those boundaries and barriers. When we were in Tanzania again this past summer, we were stuck on the side of the highway with a tire that wouldn't work anymore. And we're trying to figure out how to communicate with people about how long we're going to be here. Is there a bathroom around here? I mean, are we safe? I mean, all those kinds of things.
Right.
And you had to slow down, and you had to recognize the power that the other has, instead of just, we have the power. Yeah, it's the story of the Good Samaritan, where we as Americans always think that we're the Good Samaritan.
Right.
Because we have the power, we have the money, we go help. And we do a lot of that, which is great. But in that situation, we needed a Good Samaritan. We did not have the power. All the money in the world wouldn't have fixed that bus. They're sitting there with a screwdriver and a hammer, trying to hammer out these ball bearings that welded together inside this wheel for hours. We were completely helpless, and they were the Samaritans for us. So when you have these different language disparities and you have to work together, you have to recognize the agency, the power that the other has. And it's not just our way, it's how do we do this together?
Right.
And those are some beautiful moments when human beings from all over the world can get together, don't speak the same language, don't eat the same foods, but they recognize the power in others. And there are people that are really trying to do that in our world.
Well, and arguably, especially at the time that we're at, is a very, very important message in its own right. You know, we don't always speak even necessarily the same language as our current neighbor, you know, depending on their belief system. But we still have to be able to communicate and work together.
And that brings us right into the story I want to talk about today, which is with the Samaritan and Jesus, this woman. I almost hate to say woman, because all of a sudden now it's like, okay, now you're in gender stuff. And so I want to share some things that I've been thinking about and reading about for years. But when we started this podcast, I wasn't sure that the people that would listen to it would be able to be open to hearing it.
Okay.
But now we're down into 4 episodes and 5 weeks of preaching or whatever, and engaged Bible studies. People are starting to go. They're not freaked out. They're able to work through some things they've never heard of. Like there's a Nimrod in chapter 10, who's the only one that's being described in that genealogy, which we typically don't even read through.
Right.
That is in building cities and building monuments. The taller the monument, the stronger you are or your God is, building monuments to himself for self-worship. And so people are starting to not be so intimidated or so frustrated with this new information. So I want to share some stuff about the Good Samaritan, the Samaritan woman. Now we're in the Samaritan world. And start out with exactly what you left off with, our neighbors.
Yeah.
Samaritans and Jews did not get along. The Samaritans were the ones that were, many of them were the ones that were left behind when the Assyrians came in and took the Jews back to Assyria. It might have also been when Babylon came in. So they were the left behind ones. They were the ones that were there. And they claim tribal ancestry to Ephraim and Manasseh, or Manasseh still. I told people on Sunday, say it with confidence, even if you're not really sure how to say the word. And those 2 leaders are the sons of Joseph. So you have the 12 tribes. They all had their land. Mm-hmm. Joseph never got land, but when everybody came back into Canaan, into Israel, which wasn't called Israel at the time, there was land that was split between 2 brothers. And so then you still had 12 tribes, because Joseph didn't have, and then the Levites were the priestly class. Levi, they did not have their own land. So you add Manasseh and Ephraim back in the mix, now you have 12. So the city Samaria was the capital at one time before Jerusalem became the capital. So the Samaritans have really deep pride in who they are as a culture and who they claim their ancestry to be. When the Jews were released back to Israel, Palestine, Canaan, that area, the Samaritans were already there. And the Samaritans and the Jews had very different ideas about Judaism. They didn't have the same places of worship. They didn't worship together. They had different historical holy sites. The story of Isaac takes place in 2 different places, one where the Samaritans have their holy place and one where the Jews have their holy place. So they don't even agree on stuff like that. And they track a lot of their teachings in different ways than the Jews do. So they're not together. It could remind you of, Protestants and Catholics, but even worse.
Okay.
Like even bigger divide. And they don't do this together. So the fact that the Jews consider themselves to be the best, to be the higher, more clean version of Judaism. The Samaritans did too. So, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Everybody's claiming the truth, and no one can agree. For some reason, Jesus decides to walk through their land. He could have gone around. He didn't have to. Most Jews would have gone around to the coast, up the coast, and then into Galilee, on the Mediterranean coast. But he decides he's going to walk through. And I think he does it for a really big reason. And I think it's a reason we have lost in translation. And it's not about a woman's morality with all the husbands. So there's a chiasm in John that we want to take a look at.
Okay.
So there are times in the Gospel of John where there are theological debates or there are theological conversations. And guess how many there are?
Debates or theological?
Both. They're both. Yeah, they're both. They're kind of the same.
I mean, in one Bible?
Just in the Gospel of John.
Just in the Gospel of John.
There's a certain number of theological conversations that are happening with Jesus.
I mean, if we're going back to number recognition, the number, I think, is it 7 always is like something you point out?
7.
7, okay.
So in the Gospel of John, there's 7.
Which is a meaning in its own right.
It's a meaning in its own right. So
I'm learning things, PD.
Yeah. So in John chapter 1, you have who is this Jesus? There's this conversation that's going on about who Jesus is with the religious leaders. And then in John chapter 2, you have Jesus with the wedding at Cana and saying it's not yet my time. And he calls his mom woman, which, I would never call my mom woman. Part of my face would be over on this part of my face. Then there's this chapter 3, this theological debate with Nicodemus, a high priest, who we lose track of a lot in the Gospel of John. But later on in the Gospel of John actually defends Jesus, and then he's at the end of the Gospel of John, he's one of the ones that brings Jesus and prepares his body for burial. So Nicodemus has a lot bigger story than we think about it. Then there's this chapter 4. There's a conversation, which I think is a theological debate with a Samaritan woman. Okay. Then there's this healing on the Sabbath that Jesus does in chapter 5. And that is being like, okay, what are you doing on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to be doing that kind of stuff on the Sabbath. That's a debate. Then there's this feeding of the 5,000 that happens. Who is this Jesus? What is he trying to do? There's a debate on, how generous is God? All those kinds of things. And then there's this festival of the booths where there's this conversation about who Jesus is. So there's all these debates that go on in the first 7 chapters. Chapter 4, right in the middle, is the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. To me, that's the heart. That's the heart of those first 7 chapters. And I believe it's there for more than just a morality question. Because Jesus walks, this is how it normally has been shared. This is the normal theological conversation about this. There's a woman at a well,
okay,
and it happens at the heat of the day. And she's there at the heat of the day instead of in the morning because all the other women in the village have shunned her for her immorality. So she can't be there in the morning because the women are mean to her, are bullying her, and she's shunned because she's had all these husbands. So it's turned into like a sexual immorality story with this woman. She's there at the heat of the day, gathering water, and then Jesus walks up, and they have this conversation about Jesus being the living water. And then Jesus says to her, I know that you've had all these husbands, and the one you're with right now is not your husband. And the Samaritan woman then leaves her jar at the well and runs back to the village and says, this is a man that's told me everything I've ever done. And the village is so, and then we kind of stop there. But what happens is the village is so enamored with what this woman's saying that they invite Jesus to come hang out with them for 2 days. Here's a Jewish rabbi hanging out with a bunch of Samaritans. It's a heck of a lot more than just a woman sexual immorality. Couple things. If this woman was so shunned that she could not go to the well in the morning with the other women, when she comes back to the town, why do people believe her?
Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to say. I thought you were going to say that nobody was going to believe her.
Yeah, no, they all believe her. And many of them come to faith. So if she's so shunned, why is her voice then respected? So there's something else going on there. Also, in the Gospel of John, John uses light and darkness. So a lot of people will come to Jesus in the night because they're confused. They don't know. Like Nicodemus comes to Jesus at dark. Now, is he hiding from the other Pharisees or the other religious leaders or whatever? Maybe. But John's using that as a way to say Nicodemus doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. He's not dumb. He's a very, very smart guy. But he's ignorant about who Jesus is. And John uses light and darkness all of the time. So this story takes place at the most brilliant light of the day. That you can't get more light.
Which means what?
Which means something is going to be revealed. And something's going to be revealed, and it's not going to be the sexual immorality of this woman. Another thing, too, is that this woman would not have probably been allowed to have, on her own, 5 husbands. She had 0 agency. She could not ask anybody to marry her. If she lost if she did have 5 actual husbands, she would not have control over who they were. Because the first one would have died. Then the brother or relative would have married her, because that's the tradition. So her brother-in-law would marry her, or her uncle-in-law. Then that husband would have died. So then she would have had to have another brother or another uncle-in-law marry her 5 different times. So if that actually happened, she is filled with tragedy. And she wouldn't have been allowed to just be living with a guy. I mean, that's just not the way it works in those days. It's just not the way it works. And if that is completely true, nobody would believe her. They still believed her. So something else is going on. So I want to propose something that is some thinking. It may be a little bit out of the box, but I think it's good for conversation, and I think it makes a lot more sense.
Okay.
The conversation that happens between this woman and Jesus is as equals. There is not a sense of, well, this is a Jewish man, I better bow down and I better cower. She doesn't cower. She's strong, and she gives her opinion. And I think this is a theological debate about who the Samaritans are worshiping and who Jesus is. I think we take it out of the personal immorality thing, and because there isn't a single other time in the Gospel of John outside of this woman who's been caught in adultery, which is not in the original manuscripts, by the way. That was added later, which is a whole nother. When we get to some other books of the Bible, we'll talk about how you read your Bible and when some things get added in and those kinds of things. But in everything else, the Gospel of John, Jesus isn't running around as the morality police.
Right.
He's not. He's having theological debates about who he is. He is the Son of God. And very clear, very open. No other gospel has Jesus running around saying, I'm the Son of God. He's done it all the time in John. Matthew does. And actually some of the other gospels, Jesus says, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody that you know who I am. But in John, it's like, it's me. It's here I am. So here's what I think is happening here. There's a couple things we don't see. First of all, they meet at a well. When a man and a woman meet at a well in our Old Testament, something is going to happen. It's a meeting place. And typically what happens in the big patriarchal story is there's a marriage proposal that happens.
Okay.
So Jacob and Rachel in Genesis 29, Jacob is at the well, and Jacob sees Rachel and ends up kissing Rachel, which is a little interesting because I don't know if he just said, hey, I'm going to kiss you. And she's like, what? But anyway, and then Rachel and Jacob get together after there's a whole other crazy story we'll get to as well. But they meet at a well. Okay. And they become husband and wife. Moses and his wife Zipporah, they meet at a well, and they get married too.
Interesting.
Yep. There's all these marriages that are happening. Isaac even has his servant goes and meets a woman at a well and proposes on behalf of Isaac. So there's a marriage happening at this well. Jesus continues to call himself the bridegroom. Like the church is the bride, he's the bridegroom. There's all this marriage language that's happening. And Jesus and this woman meet at a well, man and woman. Jesus is the bridegroom, looking for people to be the bride, looking for people to make the commitment to Jesus. We call the church the bride, right? We're the ones that say yes to Jesus. Jesus asks us.
Right. Now,
there's some women that ask their significant other for marriage, but typically the dude does it. Not all the time, but most of the time. Traditionally.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is asking over and over and over again, will you be in a relationship with me? Will you? And waiting for us to say, I do. Now, here's the interesting part. All of these different eras of history in Samaria were different kings would bring in different people. So when you conquered a land, you would bring in your people to then settle the land, because then they're there and they take over the land.
Right.
It's what Israel is doing in some of the stuff that's happening in Palestine. They make settlements.
Right.
They put settlements there, and then it's their land. Still highly controversial, but that's what they're doing. So the king, in 2 Kings, I want to read this to you. 2 Kings, the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities. 5. Jesus says to this woman, you've had 5 husbands. 5 different cultures, and every single one of these cultures has a different god. The Babylonians have a different god, Cuthas have a different god, Avas have a different god, Hamaths have a different god, and Sepharvaim have a different god. So in that area, there's 5 different husbands asking the Sumerians, will you marry me? And the Sumerians, in order to survive, many of them may have had to submit to these gods. So Jesus is not talking to an individual woman who's had a morality problem. he's talking to the Samaritans, and the Samaritan woman is representative of the whole group of people, and saying, yeah, I know you've had 5 different husbands, which means you've had 5 different commitments, you've had 5 different gods, and then who's there now, right? The Romans are there, and the Romans are bringing in their gods. And so he says, and the one that you're living with now is not your husband either. Jesus is saying, none of these other gods are the right ones. You've had them, I get it, but I'm the living water. I'm the true bridegroom, not these 5 other cultures that brought their gods in, or the Romans who brought their gods in. This is a theological debate with the Samaritans. She goes back to her town and says, this person knows who we are, knows us, and is bringing living water. And these people then say, will you stay with us for 2 days? A group of people that should never hang out to each other or with each other. They should never be they won't even be in the same synagogue together. And Jesus ends up saying to these people, will you marry me? Will you marry me? To all these people. And many of them come to believe.
So just thinking about this as I'm breaking this down in my head, so you've got a woman who's had five husbands, 5 things, and you have 5 towns that are mentioned as well. And so are you, for discussion purposes, are you saying like the woman is more representation of all 5 of these cultures trying to come together? No,
I think that this woman is representative of the Samaritans who have had these 5 cultures, and they've assimilated in these cultures with these 5 different gods.
Okay.
And Jesus is saying, those are the wrong gods. I'm the living water. Don't go anywhere else but me. I'm the one. Now, that fits, for me at least, that fits with the claims that Jesus makes in all of these 7 different theological debates.
Interesting.
Every single one of them, Jesus says, I am the one. I'm the one. You don't have to point or look any further at all. I'm it. And right at the heart of these 7 is this conversation with this woman who I think represents the whole of Samaria. I think Jesus is trying to help the Samaritans come back to the true religion.
Okay.
And does it in a way that uses one of the most vulnerable people in society at that time, which is a woman, and uses all of these things as metaphors. I know you've had these 5 gods. I know you've had these 5 gods that are also your husbands. I'm the one. Marry me, and he hangs out with them. There's no, for me, there's just, the morality thing just doesn't make any sense, because Jesus isn't doing that in any other part of John. And if you look at the first 7 movements, this story is right in the middle of all these theological debates, and it brings out that the message that Jesus has is bigger and broader than just for the Jews, and it's for the Samaritans as well. And when we make it into a morality thing, it's much easier for us to go, oh yeah, she screwed up, look at her. And it's taking us back to the Nimrod conversation. Oh yeah, that's a Nimrod. And it absolves us of any kind of internal reflection on, okay, when was I a Nimrod? Or what gods are in my life that I'm worshiping right now? that aren't really my husband, like aren't really
Yeah.
the one for me. Money, power, prestige. We talked about that whole thing in the American Gods, technology, social media, all these different kinds of things that we spend our time with, that we're married to. I mean, we almost even say that, right?
Right.
Oh, you're married to your phone. Well, yeah, I'm on it all the time, doing whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're married to your money. You're married to this. And we use those as metaphors. I think that's what's going on in this story. I think it's way, way, way bigger, because when we turn it into a morality story, then we can point at others and absolve us. Well, I haven't had that many husbands. Now, I will say this, Darren. This is a part of the conversation.
Right.
I do believe that there are many people in our world who have been helped by this story if they see it as a morality thing, because it almost means no matter what you've done, no matter you've had 5 husbands and you're sleeping with someone right now, it's not your husband,
Right.
God will forgive you, right? I think that's powerful,
Yeah.
but I don't think that's the main part of the story. I don't think that's what this story is trying to tell us.
Well, it's kind of like this. There's this whole thing, and I won't go too long on this, but there's this whole thing with the code breaking in World War II, and I promise this will make sense.
Cool.
With Rochefort, and when it came to the whole Battle of Midway, they were trying to figure out the Japanese were gonna attack. They just didn't know where. And eventually Rochefort, the commander of the Pacific Fleet at that time, went, I need to know where they're at, and you're saying they're going to be here. I need finite evidence. And he's like, well, I can't give you finite evidence.
Yeah.
We only get pieces of information. And he's like, well, how can I trust this? Look, I might not have the definite thing.
Yeah.
But if the caterers are being ordered to go to a location,
Yeah.
and the flowers are being ordered to
Yeah.
go to a location,
Yeah.
and all these little pieces are happening,
Yeah.
well, then the wedding is happening probably at this location.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, this is kind of reminding me of the same kind of bit. It's like, look, why would the town listen to her if she was the
Pariah.
the pariah
Yeah.
of why, it makes too much sense that there's 5 gods and 5 husbands,
Yeah.
and she's still indifferent about everything.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing all these things tie together. It is really fascinating. It's almost like you need a code book at times, because you're even saying the difference. Like, so far we visited the difference between East and West, and that there's actually more meaning than direction.
Yeah.
Light and dark, whether they meet at dark or at light. And now you're saying meeting at a well. It is. I didn't know any of that.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating.
Yeah, in the big stories, the Moses, Jacob, Isaac's servant, they meet their bride at a well. And Jesus is constantly saying, I'm the bridegroom, over and over and over again. And so these stories, as we talk about the Eastern and Western mindset, of course, as a Westerner, we'd go, yeah, for sure, these are the marriages. Like, this is vows that happen 5 different times. And we forget that this woman would not have, again, even if that interpretation is the one people want to go with, she has no power. But the thing I find interesting is in that conversation, in that debate, she has power. She speaks back to him. A rabbi male, or that actually would have been the same thing back in those days. There were no rabbi females that I know of. Anyway, that'd be kind of cool to find out if there was a woman rabbi back in the time of Jesus. That'd be interesting.
Yes.
That would be interesting. But what I think this means is that for us in our world, what are the gods that we're married to? How does Jesus become the living water for us? And who do we need to meet at a well? Who's so different from us that we've got to go to a well to meet him? especially as we talk about our environment here in this election cycle. How do we talk to our neighbors and go, yeah, I know where you're at. Let's have a conversation. So anyway, that's kind of a take on that whole deal that kind of pushes us into some stories that we're going to get to.
Excellent.
With Wells. And but this coming up week, Pastor Sarah's preaching, and she's doing this thing on Abraham and even Abraham's dad that we don't even see it because we look past it.
Right.
So for those that are able to worship with us, man, come. But if you're not close to us, watch it online, and it's going to be really cool. So, and then she's being installed this Sunday too. So pretty
Awesome.
fun. Yeah.
Well, thanks, PD. This was, I mean, every time. This one actually was a lot more. I was like listening a lot more just because I was like trying to take all of it in, because there is, I'm always amazed when it comes to the Bible, like how it can be interpreted and how much like you're not seeing. And I'm definitely one of the people who is like, you're right. Why would they even listen to her? Or this whole 5 and 5, or even now that I'm catching on to like 7, it finds like there's these numbers that are so prime numbers are a thing. Anyway, so this has been fascinating.
Yeah, it'll be fun. And we're going to zoom pretty quickly after Abraham. And then actually through, when we get to Advent, we're going to pop out into Luke.
Okay.
And for Advent. And then we're going to, after the first year, we'll pop back into Genesis, where we're going to talk more about Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, fascinating character in our Bible, Hagar, and the promise that's there as well. So, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
well, you won't
cool.
have me next week. You're going to have Ethan next week because I'm going to be out.
All right.
But,
I'll tell when he's here. I'll say he's the 18th.
That's perfect. That's good to know. And you'll have me back in a couple of weeks, but I'm looking forward to it.
Cool, man. I am too. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
See you later.
Yeah.